Officer Mason Hale had seen many storms in Timberwolf Creek, but none began with his K9 partner pushing open the patrol car door and sprinting into the darkness. Thor had sensed something small, terrified, and running out of time. What Mason found deep in the woods still haunts him. 4 little girls suspended in the freezing dark. If you want more stories like this, make sure to like and subscribe. Let me know where you're watching from. Snow drifted across the lonely 2-lane highway like a living thing, curling, shifting, swallowing the world inch by inch. Officer Mason Hale had driven this stretch of rural Montana for years, but tonight, the silence felt heavier, as if the land itself was bracing for something it didn't dare name. In the passenger seat, the dashboard lights cast a soft glow across K9 Thor's sable coat. The German shepherd lay still at first, chin on his paws, listening to the storm with the kind of focus only a working dog possessed. Mason took a slow sip from his thermos, watching the beam of his headlights get eaten alive by the whiteout. Just another night, he muttered, mostly to himself. But it wasn't. Thor lifted his head. Not sharply, not like when he smelled narcotics or tracked a missing hiker, but with a deep, unsettling alertness. His ears twitched, his breath caught. Then slowly he rose, muscles coiling in silence. "What is it, boy?" Mason asked, voice tightening as he glanced towards the dark tree line. Thor didn't look at Mason. He stared straight ahead, eyes unblinking, chest trembling with a low rumble that made the hair on Mason's arms lift. This wasn't agitation. It wasn't anxiety. It was recognition and dread. Thor stepped toward the window, nose pressed to the glass, breath fogging the surface. His entire body leaned forward as if someone was calling him from deep inside the storm. Mason's instincts prickled. Years on the force had taught him to trust the dog more than radios or road maps. Thor knew things before any human ever could. A sudden gust slammed into the SUV, rocking it. Snow spiraled like shards of broken glass, tapping relentlessly against the windshield. Mason turned on the defroster, but even the hum of the heater couldn't drown out the feeling that the storm wasn't alone tonight. Thor's low growl sharpened. Then without warning, he pawed at the door. Once, twice, harder. Mason blinked. "Hey Thor, easy, what's gotten into you?" But the dog didn't ease. He barked once, sharp enough to cut through the storm, then reared back and slammed his shoulder against the door handle. Mason's pulse spiked. "Thor!" He reached out, but too late. With a force Mason had never seen him use inside a vehicle, Thor threw his weight forward, popping the latch and bursting into the blizzard. The door swung wide, sucked open by the wind. Snow blasted into the cabin. Mason lunged after him, boots sinking up to the ankle as soon as they hit the ground. The cold punched straight through his uniform. Thor didn't stop, didn't even look back. He moved with terrifying purpose, bounding toward the tree line, tail low, body tense, barking in short, desperate bursts. Not alarm, not warning. A plea. Something was out there. Something alive. Something in danger. Mason pressed the radio on his shoulder. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12, I've got..." Static hissed loud enough to sting his ear. He tried again. Nothing. The storm had swallowed the signal whole. "Perfect," he muttered, breath fogging as he chased Thor's trail. The dog's tracks cut a clean pattern across the powder. Deep, fast, urgent. Mason felt the first spike of true unease. Thor had never opened a patrol car door in his life. Never disobeyed a command like this. Whatever he sensed wasn't just unusual. It was catastrophic. Mason tucked his chin into his collar and pushed forward, snow stinging his face, wind howling like a warning he didn't yet understand. "I'm coming, boy," he called hoarsely. "Just don't lose me." But Thor was already a shadow disappearing into the pines, and Mason Hale, veteran officer, level-headed, unshakable, felt the first cold flicker of fear. Something waited in that forest. Something small, something broken, something that had screamed into the storm and only a dog had heard it. The wind tightened around Mason Hale before he even realized Thor had vanished into the white blur ahead, the dog's dark shape swallowed by sheets of drifting snow. Mason pushed forward, boots sinking deep as the storm gained strength, the gale flattening branches and pulling at the brim of his cap. A moment ago, Thor had simply tensed in the patrol car, keyed up by a signal only he could interpret. Now the dog ran with a conviction that tore through everything Mason understood about him. Thor wasn't just moving quickly. He was moving with purpose, head low, breath, heavy tracking something that Mason couldn't see or hear. Snowflakes stung Mason's cheeks as he lifted the radio again, thumb brushing the frozen plastic, his breath forming shaky clouds in the frigid air. Dispatch Unit 12. K9 in pursuit of unidentified. The sentence died under a burst of static. A second attempt brought only a wavering hiss. The storm had choked the signal to nothing. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was tight-strained, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Mason tried again, adjusting position, turning his body towards the open stretch of highway behind him. "Dispatch, come in." Crackling. A faint buzz. Then absolute stillness. The radio settled into a dull hum, useless in the cold. Mason lowered his arm and kept moving. Each step grew heavier as snow drank the warmth from his clothes and tightened around his boots. The world beyond 6 feet dissolved into swirling white trees appearing and disappearing like ghosts. Only the sharp, determined impressions of Thor's paws guided him, now stamping a path through the drifts. Their depth revealed the dog's speed, his urgency. They were spaced far apart, straight and unwavering, carving a line that cut north toward the timber. Mason's pulse quickened. Thor had worked search and rescue drills for years, trained to locate hikers and missing kids. He knew how to track. But this wasn't routine alertness. It was something deeper, something instinctive, a pull. Mason felt it too. Now a strange tightening beneath his ribs, a sense that the storm was not the only force gathering around them. The deeper he pushed, the more the forest closed in, branches heavy with ice bowing overhead. Wind moaned between the trees, carrying a sound Mason couldn't identify. Faint, high-pitched, almost like a cry, but stretched thin by the storm until it was nearly unrecognizable. He stopped, breath hitching. Was it the wind? Was it something else? Thor's tracks never wavered. The dog had heard something, felt something. And if Thor sensed fear or danger, he ran toward it, not away. That thought tightened Mason's jaw. He lowered his head and pressed forward with renewed urgency, every muscle working against the drag of the drifts. Snow rose to his shins, then his knees. He tugged his jacket tighter, but the cold pressed straight through the layers. He focused on the prints, one after another after another. Steady, fast. Thor was still close, but gaining distance with each passing moment. Mason couldn't let that happen. His boots hit a slope beneath the snow hidden by the storm, and he staggered before regaining his footing. The faint sound he'd heard earlier flickered again, almost like a whimper carried on the wind. Small, fragile. Mason froze, listening, hard breath stilling in his throat. The wind roared, branches clattered, and the cry faded as suddenly as it had come. But Thor had heard it first. That was why he ran. Mason swallowed hard, heart tightening. "Hang on, boy," he murmured into the storm voice, trembling with cold. "I'm right behind you." He pushed forward again, following the trail as it curved between 2 snow-laden pines. The woods deepened, the air sharpened, and Thor's tracks, still fresh, but now partially softened by wind, led Mason farther into a darkness the storm had not yet filled. The prints angled downhill toward a dense cluster of trees huddled against one another like a wall. Beyond them, the forest grew strangely quiet, as if the storm itself hesitated to enter. Mason stepped toward the threshold, snow falling harder, wind biting across his face, eyes narrowing to see where Thor had gone, as the path pitched further into the trees and the world turned darker ahead. Mason stepped through the narrow break between the pines, the storm muffling the world into a dim gray hush, and his breath caught when he saw Thor's silhouette finally pause ahead. The dog stood rigid, tail lowered and pressed to the ground, as if reading a message the snow was desperate to hide. Mason hurried forward, boots sinking deep, and when he reached Thor's side, the beam of his flashlight swept across the forest floor and revealed a scattering of tiny footprints. They were small, impossibly small, no larger than the palm of his gloved hand stamped into the snow in frantic, uneven patterns. His heart tightened. These were not the tracks of one child, but several branching and crossing in tangled lines that told a story too grim to ignore. Some prints were sharp and clear, as if left by running feet, but others dragged in shallow arcs as though the owner had been pulled forward by force. Mason lowered himself to examine them more closely. Snowflakes clung to the edges, but the outlines remained distinct. The pattern deepened his unease. He had seen the tracks of lost hikers, of teenagers wandering after dark, of frightened campers stumbling back to the road, but he had never seen tracks like these. The children who left them had not been wandering. They had been driven, taken. Thor moved beside him, sniffing hard breath, rising in short puffs as his ears flattened with a soundless tension. The dog stepped to the right, toward a cluster of low-hanging branches weighed down by ice, and Mason followed the subtle shift of his gaze. There streaked across a broken twig was a thin smear of bright red. Mason's breath hitched. He leaned closer, brushing snow aside, revealing the unmistakable shine of fresh blood. Not old, not diluted, recent, within minutes, perhaps less. The cold wrapped tighter around him, but this time it wasn't the weather, it was dread. A slow, heavy dread that made his pulse hammer against his ribs. He stood scanning the trees, feeling the storm press like a wall on all sides. Whoever these children were, they had come through here, hurt, scared, and far too quietly. Thor let out a soft whine, not of fear, but urgency, as he continued pacing in tight circles. His agitation confirmed what Mason already felt in his gut. Something terrible had happened in this forest, something still unfolding. Mason lifted his radio again, forcing calm into his voice. "Dispatch Unit 12. I have multiple juvenile tracks and possible injuries. Request immediate patrol backup and aerial search once visibility allows." Static answered. A long, uninterrupted hiss. He adjusted the antenna, stepped to the left, tilted it upward. The only response was the scratch of interference swallowed by the wind. The storm had blocked every channel. He tried again, louder this time, but the result remained the same. Only white noise, only silence. He lowered the radio, slowly, fingers tightening around the casing. He had never felt this cut off before. Even in the worst Montana blizzards, some signal managed to slip through some thread of sound to hold on to. Tonight, there was nothing. Thor pressed his shoulder gently against Mason's leg, grounding him. The simple contact steadied Mason enough to think past the rising panic. The children who left these tracks were close. They had to be. The cold would not allow them to go far. And wherever they were, they needed someone who could still move, still think, still fight for them. Mason exhaled slowly, watching the breath disperse in the air like a fading promise. He took in the footprints again, tracing them with his eyes until they disappeared into deeper shadow beneath the trees. He swept the flashlight beam across the snow, ignoring the sting of wind on his face, searching for anything more, any sign of direction, any clue to follow. Thor's nose lifted suddenly. The dog's body angled north toward a darker stretch of forest, where the pines grew denser and the snow formed deeper drifts. Thor took a single step that way, then looked back at Mason with an expression that was not human but still somehow clear. "This way." Mason nodded once, tightening his gloves and adjusting the strap of his radio, even though it remained silent. "All right," he murmured, voice low. "Lead on." Thor lowered his head and began moving again, paws barely making sound, as he followed a trail only he could fully decipher. Mason stayed close behind, the tiny footprints fading between the trees as the storm swept more snow across them, obscuring the path, erasing the story. But Thor did not hesitate. He pushed forward with a determination shaped by instinct and training, and something deeper, something that pulled him toward the heart of the forest, where the tracks grew fainter, and the air colder, and the drifting snow hid shapes that might have been branches, or might have been something else entirely, as Mason followed him into the tightening dark. Thor lifted his head, released a low, trembling howl that vibrated through the frozen air, and then surged deeper into the forest with renewed urgency. Mason followed closely, the crunch of his boots muffled by the thickening blanket of snow as trees closed around them like towering sentinels. The storm dimmed the world into gray shadows and shifting movement, but Thor navigated with instinctive certainty, weaving between trunks, pausing only long enough to confirm a direction before pressing onward. Mason swept his flashlight across the ground and felt his chest constrict at what the beam revealed. The tiny footprints they had followed earlier no longer formed clear paths. They overlapped now, scattering in panicked bursts, marking sudden changes in direction. The tracks mirrored fear made visible children running without guidance, stumbling over their own steps, pushed or dragged through the snow, with no sense of escape. Mason knelt for a closer look, fingers tightening around the flashlight as he traced the widening chaos in the patterns. Some impressions were deep and sharp, where little feet had landed hard, but others dragged behind them, carving thin lines through the snow, as though a small body had been pulled forward with no strength to resist. Vivid unease coiled in Mason's stomach. These children had not only been forced through the woods, they had fought, they had resisted, they had suffered. Thor trotted ahead but slowed near a slope where the snow appeared disturbed. Mason approached and realized the ground bore signs of struggle. Snow pushed outward in uneven bursts, branches snapped low to the ground, pine needles scattered across the white surface. Someone had tried to break free here. Someone small, someone desperate. Mason stood scanning the trees, feeling the storm press against his shoulders, as if urging him to move faster. His breath fogged the air in short, uneven bursts. He had been on search teams before, had found lost hikers, injured hunters, even runaway teens, but he had never seen signs that carried this kind of desperation. The forest felt heavier now, quieter, as though it remembered what had passed through it and held the echoes in the wind. Thor's sudden shift drew Mason forward again. The dog lowered his body nose close to the ground, following the muted scent only he could discern. When Thor cut left toward a thicket partially buried under wind-blown snow, Mason immediately followed, pushing aside a curtain of frozen branches. Beneath the lowest limbs of a pine, weighed down by ice, something small protruded from the snow, a pale blue shape, dusted with white. Mason dropped to one knee, brushed away the thin layer of frost, and felt his heart clench. It was a child's shoe, tiny, leather stiffened by cold. The design was simple, decorated with a faint embroidered flower along the side. A shoe that belonged to a girl who could not have been more than 5 years old. Mason lifted it gently, swallowing against the tightness in his throat. His gloves brushed the lining, finding it nearly frozen solid. A child had lost this recently, very recently. The cold would not have allowed it to linger long without being buried completely. Thor nosed the shoe, then turned sharply toward the north ear's pinned muscles coiled. He barked, not loud, not wild, but with a determined edge that told Mason the trail had sharpened. Time was slipping away. Mason stood tucking the tiny shoe inside his coat to preserve it, and looked into the dense wall of trees ahead. The storm muffled sound, but even through the wind he sensed the weight of the forest deepening, the air growing colder as the trail pulled them further from the safety of the road. He felt the pressure of urgency settle over him like an icy mantle. The children who left these signs were close to the limits of survival. The freezing night allowed no mercy. Thor barked again and began moving paws, tapping through the deepening snow with a precision shaped by instinct and years of training. Mason followed, heart pounding, as he pushed forward into the unknown space where the footprints thinned. The shadows lengthened, and the trail ahead threatened to disappear beneath the falling snow, while Thor led him toward what remained of the fading path in the dark. Thor pushed ahead with increasing urgency as Mason trudged through the deepening drifts, the storm shifting from a steady fall to a sweeping gust that tugged at branches and sent loose snow swirling across the ground like spectral waves. The forest thinned unexpectedly, trees parting just enough for the wind to surge through, with a force that lifted veils of snow from the earth and revealed something Mason hadn't seen until that exact moment. At first it looked like a shadow, a large, hunched shape at the edge of visibility. But as the wind cleared the air again, the outline sharpened into the unmistakable form of a cabin. It stood crooked and weather-beaten, its boards warped by decades of harsh winter's roof sagging beneath the weight of ice. Snow coated its walls like a second skin, muting the structure's age, yet highlighting every flaw. Mason slowed breath, tightening inside his chest. The cabin wasn't marked on any map he knew of, and in a region as meticulously surveyed as rural Montana, any unregistered structure raised immediate concern. Thor halted beside him, hackles raised, posture tight. The dog didn't bark, but a low rumble vibrated in his chest, deeper and more unsteady than anything Mason had heard from him before. Mason tightened his grip on the flashlight, sweeping its beam across the surrounding ground. The snow lay thick and undisturbed, except for one detail that made his stomach constrict. There were no tire tracks, and no clear adult boot prints, only snow scoured and filled by the storm, as if any grown person's steps had already been buried. The only visible tracks were the small, overlapping footprints of children. They clustered near the cabin's entrance, circling, stumbling, then disappearing beneath the sagging porch roof. Mason stepped closer. His throat tightened painfully when his light revealed frayed pieces of rope, dangling from the porch posts, short lengths torn and stiff from the cold. He reached out and touched one gently, its fibers rough beneath his gloved fingers. It swung slightly in the wind, as though remembering what it had once held. Thor moved to Mason's side, the dog's breathing heavy but steady. His gaze locked on the dark shape of the cabin door, and the growl that rolled out this time was sharper, edged with warning. Mason had seen Thor alert to danger before drug busts, violent arrests, missing persons in compromised situations, but this was different. Thor's entire body braced, as though he sensed something the storm was trying to hide, something that lingered just beyond the reach of light. Mason scanned the small clearing again, noting the eerie stillness that seemed to deepen the closer he came to the cabin. The wind raged around the trees, but here in front of the structure the air felt unnaturally heavy. Even the snowflakes drifted more slowly, as if reluctant to fall near the doorway. Mason stepped beneath the porch roof boots, creaking on boards that protested under his weight. He crouched beside a faint scuff mark where snow had been disturbed, brushing aside the thin layer of powder to reveal a deeper indentation in the wood. Something or someone had stood here recently, leaving no clear trail beyond the circle of footprints. The silence pressed harder now, thick and unnatural. Mason felt his pulse climb as he rose and directed the flashlight at the door. A faint smear of something dark streaked along the lower edge of the wood. He moved the beam closer. The color was unmistakable. Blood. Not frozen. Fresh. The storm should have coated it with ice by now, yet it remained visible, exposed, too recent to be anything other than a momentary clue left behind by someone in distress. Thor's growl deepened, his body leaning forward, ears pinned as he stared at the gap between the door and the frame. Mason swallowed, fingers tightening around the flashlight until his knuckles pressed painfully into the fabric of his gloves. He felt the weight of the moment settle over him, a still suspended awareness that something waited on the other side of that door. Something he had come too far to turn away from, something the storm had been trying to reveal since Thor first leapt from the patrol car. Mason reached for the handle, breath, unsteady heart, hammering in the quiet space beneath the storm as Thor stepped closer. Poised and trembling with restrained urgency, both of them bracing for whatever lay hidden inside the darkened cabin. Mason drew a steadying breath and pushed the cabin door open, the hinges shrieking with a sharp, splintered protest that cut through the storm like a cry long trapped in the wood. The sound echoed inside the dark space, bouncing off walls that seemed to inhale the cold. A bitter draft rolled out to meet him, colder than the wind outside, heavy with stillness and something far more unsettling. His flashlight beam quivered slightly as he raised it, casting trembling ribbons of light across warped floorboards, scattered debris, and a darkness so dense it felt almost physical. The air inside carried no warmth at all. It pressed against his skin, hollow and unmoving, as if the cabin had been holding its breath for hours. Thor slipped past him in a low, urgent glide, tail stiff body lowered as he scanned the shadows. Mason stepped in after him, the boards beneath his boots groaning in long, exhausted sighs. He swept the light upward instinctively, following a faint, irregular sound, something between a whimper and a shallow breath. The beam caught on movement, tiny, trembling movement. And then he saw them. Their wrists were bound high above them, ropes pulled tight enough to lift their heels off the floor, forcing their bodies into a painful, half-suspended position. Their small bodies shivered violently, their faces pale under layers of frost, their lips blue and cracked. Their breaths came in thin, uneven wisps, nearly invisible in the frigid air. For a moment the world narrowed to a pinpoint, and Mason felt something inside him freeze in place. He had braced for danger. He had braced for the unknown. But nothing could have prepared him for this. Thor rushed beneath the girls, immediately circling with frantic precision, nose brushing their ankles, chest rising and falling in sharp, anxious breaths as he tried to locate the weakest among them. His whine quivered with urgency. Mason swallowed hard, forcing his hands to stop shaking as he stepped closer. His voice cracked as he whispered, "It's all right. I'm here now." The youngest girl's head lolled to one side, her hair stiff with frost, her eyes half closed as though she hovered on the thin edge of consciousness. The oldest, perhaps 9 years old, lifted her chin with visible effort. Her eyes found Mason through the dim light, wide with a blend of fear and fading hope. A tremor rippled through her, and then in a voice barely more than breath, she whispered, "Please, help." The plea pierced the cold like a fragile thread stretching toward him, and Mason felt his heart tighten painfully in his chest. He stepped beneath her, reaching up to the knot that bit into her wrists, his gloved fingers fumbling as he tried to steady himself. The rope was thick, frozen stiff from the cold, and cut deep into her skin. Mason forced his breath to steady. "I've got you," he murmured. "Just hold on." Thor pressed his warm body against the youngest girl, first gently nudging her side with the softest movements, offering what little warmth he could. His fur brushed her frozen skin, and her lips trembled weakly, as though her body recognized the heat, even if her mind could no longer fully stay awake. Mason pulled a pocket knife from his belt and carefully sliced through the rope, binding the oldest child. The moment it snapped, her body collapsed forward, weightless and fragile, and Mason caught her against his chest. She felt impossibly cold, her limbs limp, her breath faint. He lowered her gently to the floor, positioning her close to Thor. The dog immediately shifted to share his warmth with her. Mason stood again, chest tight, and moved to the next girl. Her breaths came in soft rattles, each inhale thin and strained. He sliced through her rope, catching her just as her knees buckled, her small hands frozen into curled shapes. He whispered encouragement she likely couldn't hear, but speaking anchored him. He could not afford to hesitate. One by one, he freed them, each body growing heavier in his arms as exhaustion pulled them downward. When he reached the last girl, the smallest, she hung nearly motionless. Her eyelids fluttered as he approached, and he saw the faint shimmer of tears frozen on her cheeks. Mason cut the final rope and gathered her carefully, cradling her against his own chest. She weighed almost nothing like lifting a bundle of feathers coated in frost. Her head rested on his shoulder, and a faint puff of air brushed his collar, fragile but present. Mason knelt among the 4 trembling children, while Thor pressed himself between them, his breath slow and purposeful, as he sought to warm each fragile body in turn. Mason angled his flashlight downward, scanning their wrists, their faces, their chests rising in shallow, uneven rhythm. The cold seeped deeper around them, thickening like a warning, and Mason felt the storm outside shake the cabin walls as he searched desperately for any sign of what else might be waiting in the darkness beyond. Mason shifted the smallest girl carefully in his arms, attempting to warm her fragile body with the heat of his own as Thor pressed against the others. Arya's head rested weakly against his shoulder, her breath shallow and uneven, each inhale little more than a thin wisp of air dissolving into the cold. Mason angled his face closer to hers, trying to encourage her to stay awake, his voice barely above a whisper as he murmured gentle reassurance. Her eyelashes fluttered, dusted with frost, and her tiny fingers curled weakly into the fabric of his uniform. Then, with effort so great it seemed to drain the last of her strength, she parted her cracked lips. Her voice emerged as a trembling whisper carried on the faintest breath. They said, "No one would find us." Mason froze, heart tightening painfully as her words floated into the cold air. Arya drew another thin breath, her chest rising only slightly against his arm. "They're coming back." The warning landed heavier than any blow, and for a moment Mason could only stare at her, unable to form a response, as dread spread through him like ice water. He leaned closer, urgency tightening his voice. "Arya, sweetheart, who's coming back? How many?" But she had already drifted back into semi-consciousness, her fragile body limp in his arms, her breathing unsteady. Mason barely had time to steady her before a new sound cut through the cabin's icy silence. Snow compressed under weight. A slow, deliberate footstep just beyond the porch, then another, each one steady, controlled, intentional. Thor snapped his head toward the door, a deep growl beginning low in his chest, vibrating through the wooden floorboards. The sound grew stronger, more resonant, as his body shifted into a protective stance. His legs anchored wide, his shoulders stiffened, his tail lowered into a straight, focused line. Mason's instincts sharpened instantly. He lowered Arya gently beside the other children, arranging her close to Thor's warmth, while keeping her head elevated. His hands moved fast, but careful, his breath steady, though his pulse hammered beneath the tension. Another step in the snow, then another. Mason moved toward the door, dropping into a half-crouch as he reached for his sidearm. The cabin felt smaller now, its decaying walls tightening around him, the cold deepening with every passing second. He edged closer to the gap between the door and its warped frame. The draft bit at his face as he leaned just enough to peer through the sliver of space into the storm outside. What he saw made his breath stall. Two dark figures emerged and vanished within the sweeping snow, their outlines shifting in the muted light. They weren't rushing. They weren't frantic. They were moving slowly around the perimeter of the cabin, assessing it, surrounding it, as if they knew exactly who was inside and exactly what they intended to do next. Thor's growl deepened, becoming a warning that resonated like a living force through the narrow room. His body angled toward the door, braced with unwavering focus, eyes locked on the movement outside. Mason terraced himself against the rough wall, watching the figures draw nearer, their boots crunching through the snow in steady, predatory rhythm. The storm howled around them, but they moved with ease, their shapes growing clearer with each step, their presence unmistakable as they positioned themselves on either side of the entrance, waiting for the moment to advance, while Mason steadied his breath and tightened his grip as the cabin's thin walls shuddered under the weight of their approaching footsteps. The wind pressed hard against the cabin walls as Mason steadied himself beside the door, his pulse thundering in the cold silence while Thor remained locked in a rigid stance, every muscle taut with instinctive warning. The two dark figures outside shifted their positions with purpose, their boots crunching through the snow in a slow, deliberate pattern that Mason recognized immediately as preparation. He inhaled deeply, bracing for the moment when the standoff would break. It happened fast. A sudden violent slam struck the door, shaking the hinges so fiercely that dust drifted from the ceiling. Thor barked once, sharp and explosive, his body snapping forward defensively. Mason raised his weapon, but before he could issue a command, a second impact rattled through the cabin from the opposite side. The window shattered inward with a piercing crack as a heavy object struck it, exploding glass across the frozen floorboards like jagged shards of ice. The wind surged through the new opening, carrying snow and cold that bit at Mason's face. A dark shape lunged through the broken window, landing hard against the far wall, before pushing off and charging forward with an iron pipe raised high. Mason pivoted, adrenaline sharpening his focus as he swung his arm up to block the incoming strike. Metal met forearm with a jolt that sent pain radiating to his elbow, but he used the momentum to drive his shoulder into the attacker's chest. They crashed together onto the icy floor, sliding across the wooden board, slick with frost. The man thrashed, grip tight on the pipe, but Mason forced his weight forward, fighting for control amid the cold that seeped through his uniform. The first attacker snarled, swinging again, but Mason caught his wrist, twisting with practiced precision until the pipe slipped free and clattered across the floor. The man's breath hitched as Mason drove him back, using his body weight to pin him down. Before he could secure him, another sound sliced the air. Thor launched forward with explosive force as the second intruder burst through the half-broken door, the weakened hinges giving way under a final kick. The man barely had time to react before Thor clamped onto his arm, teeth locked with disciplined strength as he dragged the intruder down. The attacker fell hard, landing on his back with a sharp grunt, desperately trying to pull free as Thor maintained his hold, muscles bunching with controlled precision. Mason glanced over just long enough to see the second man struggle beneath the dog's weight before turning his attention back to the first attacker, who continued to fight with frantic energy. Mason pressed harder, pinning him fully, securing his arms before forcing him onto his side. Frost collected on their clothes as the cold deepened the storm, pushing wind through every crack in the structure. Behind Mason, two of the girls let out weak cries, soft and trembling, their breaths near silent. The sound cut into Mason with awful clarity, fueling a surge of determination. He shifted his weight, driving the first attacker's wrists behind his back, using a spare zip tie from his belt to restrain him quickly. The man resisted, but exhaustion and the cold were already setting in, weakening his movements until they faltered completely. Mason rose and spun just as Thor adjusted his hold, pulling the second attacker's arm down and forcing him into the floorboards. Mason moved swiftly, assisting Thor by subduing the second man's free arm and securing him in the same manner, knees pressing into the man's shoulder to hold him steady. The intruder's breath grew harsh and uneven, his struggles weakening under the combined force of dog and officer. Snow whipped through the broken window, scattering across the room like a swirling veil. Mason ensured both men were immobilized, then turned immediately toward the girls huddled beside the wall. Their breaths came in thin, unsteady whimpers. The storm outside intensified, pressing hard against the decaying structure. Mason lifted his radio once more, trying to call for backup, but only faint static greeted him, fading even further as the wind grew stronger, cutting off all remaining signal as snow piled thicker against the cabin, and the situation around him tightened with mounting urgency while he searched desperately for another solution as the storm closed in around them. The storm surged through the shattered window with renewed fury, pushing icy wind into the cabin until the cold felt almost animate, as if it seeped from the walls themselves. The structure offered nothing to soften the temperature. There was no stove, no fireplace, no insulation strong enough to battle the bitter air pressing relentlessly inside. The four little girls lay huddled near the corner, their bodies trembling violently, their breaths shallow and uneven as frost clung to their eyelashes like delicate crystals. Mason knelt beside them, his fingers stiff as he checked each child's pulse. Their skin felt like chilled porcelain beneath his gloves, and the rise and fall of their chests grew more fragile with each passing moment. The cold was winning. Mason shrugged out of his heavy jacket without hesitation, ignoring the bite of frigid air against his own arms. He draped the coat over the two youngest girls first, making sure it covered their torsos completely. His movement stayed steady even as cold crept into his muscles. He removed his thermal sweater next and spread it across the older two, tucking the edges beneath their sides to trap whatever warmth their bodies still held. "Stay with me," he murmured gently, trying to infuse his voice with steadiness. The girls didn't respond, but one of them shifted slightly, a faint instinctive attempt to move closer to the heat. Thor stepped forward, then sensing the urgency, positioning himself on his side against the two smallest children. His warm breath fanned across their cheeks as he pressed his body firmly against theirs. The dog understood without being told. He lay completely still, only adjusting when he needed to ensure better contact, his chest rising in slow, deliberate breaths meant to warm the fragile bodies pressed against him. Mason felt a swell of gratitude so sharp it nearly overwhelmed him, but he forced his focus back to the tasks at hand. The wind howled through the cracks again, carrying a sharpness that cut straight through him, even with his remaining layers. The air pierced with such intensity that each inhale made his lungs ache. Mason reached for his radio and pressed the button with stiff fingers. Dispatch Unit 12. 4 miners severe hypothermia. Need immediate evacuation. A faint crackle answered, followed by only the soft hiss of interference. He angled the device toward the broken window, then toward the ceiling, listening for any shift in the noise. But the signal remained thin and warped. The storm had nearly consumed it. "Come on," he whispered, pressing the button again with more urgency. "I need units at my location. Children in critical condition, please respond." A weak burst of static flickered through the speaker, then faded entirely. Mason exhaled slowly, trying to steady the heaviness building in his chest. He turned back to the girls, rubbing their arms gently through the layers of fabric in slow, rhythmic motions meant to stimulate blood flow without overwhelming their weakened systems. Their skin remained frighteningly cold beneath his hands, but a few faint shivers encouraged him. Shivers meant their bodies were still trying to fight. Thor adjusted his position again, curling his body protectively around the youngest girl as he nudged her gently with his nose. She barely reacted, but Mason saw a faint rise in her breathing. Thunderous gusts pounded the cabin walls, each one scattering snow across the floor. Time dragged with agonizing slowness. Mason forced himself to stay alert, dividing his attention between the unconscious attackers, the storm outside, and the fragile children who depended on him. Then, through the roar of the wind, a faint shout drifted into the cabin. Mason's head snapped up, heart leaping. He rose quickly and moved toward the door, cupping his hands around his mouth to call out. Here inside the cabin. The storm muffled his voice, but another shout responded closer this time. Branches cracked outside as figures pushed through the snow, their flashlights cutting narrow beams across the swirling white. Officers emerged slowly from the storm, bundled heavily, their movements labored against the wind's force. They had found his abandoned patrol SUV on the highway, and when he never answered the radio, followed his and Thor's frozen tracks through the trees until the shape of the cabin finally rose out of the white. One of them spotted Mason at the doorway and motioned urgently. "We can't get vehicles up here," he called, voice strained. "The drifts are too high. We'll have to carry them out." Mason stepped aside immediately to lead them in. When the officers entered the cabin and saw the children lying motionless on the floor, their expressions tightened, but they moved quickly. They took off coats, wrapped the girls tightly in layers, and lifted them with careful precision. The storm fought every step as the officers carried the fragile children into the blinding wind, cradling them against their chests to share what warmth they could as Mason followed into the night, where the cold pressed harder with every second, and the forest seemed to blur into a single urgent path carved by necessity. The world outside the ambulance doors remained a blur of white and wind, but inside the bright hallways of Timberwolf Creek Medical Center, warmth wrapped around Mason like a long-awaited breath. Nurses rushed the 4 rescued girls down the corridor, their small bodies bundled in thick blankets, their cheeks pale beneath the fluorescent lights. Mason followed closely, the cold still clinging to his uniform, while Thor trotted beside him with quiet determination, his ears pinned forward as if tracking every fragile heartbeat. Doctors guided the girls into an emergency treatment room, filled with soft beeping monitors and heated units prepared for severe hypothermia. Medical staff surrounded the beds, moving with practiced speed as they applied warming blankets, adjusted oxygen masks, and gently checked for signs of responsiveness. Mason stood near the doorway, unwilling to interfere, but unable to look away as the children fought their way back toward consciousness. Thor lay down beside him, lowering his head to his paws, but keeping his eyes focused on the girls with the same vigilance he had shown in the cabin. Minutes felt like long, stretched threads of time, until finally one of the monitors emitted a steadier rhythm. Lily, the oldest girl, stirred beneath her blanket. Her eyelids fluttered open, slowly revealing eyes still clouded with exhaustion and fear. Her gaze roamed the room in confusion until it settled on Mason standing a few feet away. Her lips parted, and in a faint whisper that seemed to carry every ounce of her fragile strength, she said, "You came back." Mason stepped closer, his voice soft as he pointed toward Thor. "He found you," Mason replied. Emotion tightening in his chest, he never stopped. Thor lifted his head, patting forward to rest it gently against the side of Lily's bed. Lily managed a tired, grateful smile and reached out with a trembling hand to touch his fur. The contact seemed to steady her, a fragile bridge between terror and safety. As the nurses continued working, a group of officers approached Mason in the hallway. Their expressions were grave, the weight of new information pressing behind their eyes. Lieutenant Harper stepped ahead of the others holding a thin tablet containing the first findings from the 2 men Mason had apprehended. Mason's face hardened as the lieutenant spoke. The men belonged to a child trafficking network operating across multiple states. Their pattern involved abducting vulnerable children, transporting them in small groups and leaving behind no evidence. This particular group had planned to deliver the 4 girls to a remote buyer, but when the storm trapped their vehicle and disrupted their timing, they made a decision that chilled Mason to the core. They intended to leave the girls to the cold, knowing the storm would cover their tracks. Once the blizzard passed, they planned to return, dispose of the bodies, and continue their operation without a trace. The lieutenant's voice grew heavier. If Thor hadn't reacted the moment he did, they would have achieved exactly that. Mason exhaled slowly, absorbing the truth that tightened his chest with a mix of anger, disbelief, and gratitude. The storm had been fierce, yet something deeper, an instinct, a sense of urgency in Thor's bones had led them straight to the children. Mason returned to the treatment room, needing to see the girls with his own eyes. Heat filled the room, now curtains pulled back to reveal 4 beds lined side by side. June and Mara slept peacefully, their hands resting atop warm blankets. A nurse glanced at the chart at the foot of her bed and said softly, "Her name is Arya." Arya, the smallest, had color returning to her cheeks, her breathing steadier and stronger than Mason had dared to hope. Thor walked toward her bed, lowering himself gently so that his warm back pressed along the rail. The girl stirred, opened her eyes briefly, and reached for him with tiny fingers that curled softly into his fur, before she drifted back to sleep. Mason took a seat between the beds, the exhaustion of the night finally beginning to settle into his bones. Yet he kept his posture upright, unwilling to let his guard down while the girls remained so vulnerable. Thor shifted, curling himself in the space between all 4 beds, sprawling gently, as if forming a protective barrier of warmth and presence. His breath rose and fell in steady, soothing rhythm. Mason watched the rise and fall of the girls' chests, each breath a quiet testament to the fragile miracle unfolding before him. The harsh glow of the cabin, the frozen darkness, the crack of splintering wood, all of it faded beneath the warm hospital lights that bathed the children in safety. In the quiet that followed, Mason felt a profound stillness settle into the room, as if time itself paused to honor the hope restored within these 4 small lives. He rested his hand on Thor's shoulder, gratitude welling in his chest. In the soft halo of the hospital lights, watching Thor doze with peaceful vigilance, while the girls slept soundly around him, Mason thought with unwavering certainty, "Some angels walk on 4 paws." If this story touched you, please like the video and subscribe to support the channel. Which moment struck you most? Thor sensing the danger, the cabin scene, or the girls waking up safe? And where are you watching from? Share your thoughts below so we can see how far these stories travel.